Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah, we can. I don't know if you can see the room, but this is Steph Levis. I'm with the Star. I'm moderating, and the question is from Mia Rabson, the Canadian Press.
I'm just wondering, Minister Fraser, if you could address the comments made on the weekend by Minister Hutchings about this being because there was pressure from Atlantic Liberals, there's more Atlantic Liberals, and that if more Liberals were possibly elected in Alberta, they would have more influence.
My perspective is that this is about home heating oil, and certainly there's a larger number, or larger proportion, I should say, of home heating oil users in Atlantic Canada. There's more by raw number in Quebec and Ontario, but the rationale behind the policy change is that home heating oil is a terrible source of pollution. It is not an efficient use of fuel, and it's extremely expensive. The decision to move forward with a plan to ramp up the heat pump installation is going to help us get off home heating oil the same way that we're trying to get off coal at a grid level. So from my perspective, this is a way to accelerate the transition to get off a polluting fossil fuel source. But importantly, I live in a community where we've seen a lot of heat pump uptake in the last number of years, but not as much as I would like. And the people who've made the change are saving, in some instances, thousands of dollars every year. So from my perspective, targeting a terrible source of pollution that costs families a lot of money is a sensible thing to do.
So I noticed you didn't directly answer the question about Minister Hutchings' comments. Do you disagree with what she said? Because those comments are being used to accuse your government of doing this entirely for political purposes because you're at risk of losing seats in Atlantic Canada.
I disagree that it's purely motivated by politics, as you've just suggested in your question. And when you look at the rural rebate, when you look at the exemption, and when you look at the heat pump program, every province is eligible for those things. What we've done on the heat pump piece in particular is we started with the home oil, the heat pump affordability grant, and we made an offer to every province to see if they wanted to help transition off home heating oil. But we asked them to make a contribution to it as well. Nova Scotia, PEI, and Newfoundland have all agreed to do it and co-fund and co-deliver a program to make it easy for people to transition. When I look at different kinds of programs that have disproportionate impacts on different parts of the country, that's part of policy making in Canada. We certainly have a higher proportion of funding for federal wharfs for the lobster fishery come to Atlantic Canada than other parts of the country. And we have more going to abandoned wells and the energy sector in parts of Western Canada and through agriculture to the prairies. What we're trying to do is target a serious environmental issue, the reliance on home heating oil, which is a big pollutant, and we found a way to do it that's going to save people thousands of dollars per year. So from my perspective, the motivation is aligned with what I've been hearing in my community. People want to do their part to reduce pollution, but they also want to do it in a way that saves people money. So from my perspective, this was a sensible approach designed to address that specific issue.
David?
Hi, Minister David Thurton from CBC News. But I mean, I guess to the question, I mean, would other provinces, have the same solution that you guys came up with on carbon pricing if they elected more Liberal MPs? I mean, yeah.
Look, to your question, it's hard for me to answer because the same rules apply in every part of Canada. When we're dealing with a policy that targets not specifically a region, but a polluting source of fuel, there may be a disproportionate impact on regions that use that fuel more, but there's not actually a differential in application as between Atlantic Canada, Quebec, Ontario, and Western Canada, because we're targeting a home heating oil. So it's hard to say that there would have been a different or better deal with more members of one party or another. When in fact the same deal exists across the country, but because of the over-reliance, typically by low and middle income families in Atlantic Canada on home heating oil, there may be a greater result on both the environment and affordability as a result of that choice. But there's uniform application at a household level, regardless of which province or jurisdiction that you live in this country.
I'm just wondering, as a follow-up, if you could respond to what the NDP has been calling for, which is for the government to remove the GST on all home heating sources. So was that a discussion at Atlantic Caucus or among Atlantic MPs? And why did you all come forward with the request to remove the carbon price instead of home heating GST?
There's not a discussion that we're having to remove the GST on all sources of home heating oil. And I personally remain committed to carbon pricing, and you can go back to my time as the parliamentary secretary to then Minister McKenna in the House of Commons, arguing that putting in place a policy that will put a price on pollution and return more back to households is the right approach. What we've done with this policy is taken the solution specifically for home heating oil out of a market context. We're solving this problem a different way through substantial government intervention, which is designed to get rid of a polluting source of fuel, home heating oil. If we've taken the solution out of the market, using a market signal through the price doesn't create the same incentive that otherwise would have existed. When we're dealing with a group of people across the country, but disproportionately potentially in Atlantic Canada, although again, Quebec and Ontario do have more users than Atlantic Canada, what we end up seeing is that if people have made the decision to change as a result of the government financing directly or covering in some instances the total cost of the heat pump delivery and installation, the price on that specific fuel source, it doesn't create the same incentive that it did in the absence of the solution presented through government intervention. So from my perspective, it's a sensible policy that recognizes that the price was designed to create an incentive to change, but we have created a different non-market incentive to change through the introduction of a program that will more quickly get people off home heating oil altogether.
For anybody who might be watching remotely right now, I just want to make clear that the actual official news conference with Ministers Freeland, Anand, and Fraser has not begun, and we're just using this time that Minister Fraser has given us to ask him some questions as though it was a post-caucus scrum as opposed to the formal news conference. Anybody else from the floor have a question? Valérie Michaela.
Bonjour, Monsieur Fraser. En français, donc, vous
Minister
êtes un
Fraser.
ministre des
I'll
provinces
ask my question in
atlantiques.
French. You are a minister from the Atlantic
Si
provinces.
on renversait
So,
la mesure et que c'était, par
if
exemple,
the
les provinces de
measure
l'Ouest qui bénéficiaient d'une
were
mesure comme
applied
celle-ci,
differently and it were
et
Western
pas
provinces
les
who benefited from a
résidents
measure like this and
de
not
votre province,
the
est-ce que
people
vous
in your
trouveriez ça
province,
juste? Je
would you
comprends
find
que
it fair?
vous avez parlé de cette mesure comme étant un incitatif,
You've said that this
mais
measure
au final, dans
is
le
a
regard des
way
gens,
of
ça ne
encouraging
change
people
rien. Ce
to
qu'ils
make certain
entendent, c'est
moves,
que
but in
d'un
fact,
côté, il y a
it
des gens qui
changes
vont payer un
nothing.
peu
On
moins
the
cher
one
pour
hand,
leur
there are people who will
chauffage
be paying for their heating oil,
parce qu'il n'y aura pas de
will paying
redevance,
a
et
bit
de l'autre
less,
côté, il y en a qui vont payer la redevance.
and then others will have to pay more.
Est-ce que vous êtes OK si je pose mes réponses en anglais, juste pour des
Is it
détails?
okay if I answer in English?
Le but était d'avoir la réponse en français, mais si
Actually, I
vous
was
êtes pas en
trying to
mesure
get
de
the
la
answer
donner
in
en
French,
français,
but
on va laisser faire.
if you can't do that, that's fine.
Non, je vais essayer. C'est difficile pour moi juste pour utiliser la clarité, mais c'est possible pour moi d'offrir des commentaires supplémentaires en anglais si nécessaire. C'est OK pour moi hein, de recogniser les différences dans les régions du Canada. Alors, juste pour exemple, quand le gouvernement a besoin de collaborer avec des provinces dans le Canada-Ouest, Alberta, par exemple, sur l'enjeu de en anglais, abandoned wells. Il n'y a pas un bénéfice pour la région atlantique, mais je pense que c'est une bonne chose parce que le politique est désigné pour réduire les conséquences environnementales. Il y a beaucoup d'exemples quand une politique a adressé un enjeu important dans les régions différentes. Quand le gouvernement a utilisé les fonds pour les transits publics, c'est un grand bénéfice pour les grandes cités partout notre pays. Mais pour ma communauté, des petites villes, la communauté rurale, il y a juste du projet très petit pour soutenir des efforts locaux. What I think is important to understand is that when you're addressing a different problem in a country as diverse as Canada, as a country as large as Canada, with different interests and different issues that impact different regions in unique ways, it's okay to address those problems. My sense is that there is a national challenge around home heating oil that disproportionately affects Atlantic Canada, but there have been changes made to recognize unique situations where the federal government has funded solutions for different regions of the country. And I don't just think that's fair. I think it's necessary. Canada is not a monolithic entity. We are a country who has a rich diversity of regions and interests, and I think that strengthens the social fabric of the country.
Votre collègue laisse sous-entendre que
Your
s'il y avait
colleague
plus de
has
députés libéraux dans
indicated
l'Ouest
that if there
canadien,
were
eux aussi
more
auraient pu
Liberal MPs
bénéficier
in the
d'une mesure
West,
comme
they
celle-là.
could
Vous
also
répondez quoi
have
à ça?
gotten a rebate. What would you say to that?
Le même système appliqué au Nouvelle-Écosse et Alberta. C'est une politique uniforme, mais c'est possible pour les résultats de cette politique d'avoir un impact plus grand dans une région, en région. Et c'est OK pour moi, mais selon moi, quand la même politique est implémentée dans les régions différentes, c'est impossible pour adresser à votre question parce qu'il n'y a pas une différence dans l'application de la politique dans chaque province.
Thanks, Minister. Anybody else while we're waiting? Oh, lots of questions. Kyle, go ahead.
Hi, Minister. I have a housing question. With regard to Vancouver and increasing development charges, you had mentioned that you were going to discuss with your colleagues maybe strings tied to infrastructure or other funding streams. I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that, or if you've had those discussions, or what kind of things you were talking about.
Sure. So there are different issues, and I don't want to conflate them, but they are interrelated given the nature of your question. So first, on different conditions that we're looking at for federal transfers of money, we have been public about the fact that we're looking to attach certain housing conditionality to different funding programs. For example, we're looking at ways through the Canada Community Building Fund, formerly the gas tax, to ensure that that municipalities who benefit from the funds are using the funds to create infrastructure that will enable more housing, but also to make sure that there are measures being implemented at a local level that will foster a more housing supply in the market, which we know is absolutely essential to address the national housing crisis. We have other tools, including the permanent public transit funding, which we will be seeking to negotiate agreements with different metro regions, different communities across the country. And part of those negotiations will certainly include an assessment of how the transit funding that we invest in communities will enable them to unlock more housing. Those points have national application. The second piece, with respect to Metro Vancouver, which I expect that's the motivation behind your question, there was a 300% increase in development cost charges proposed as we were leading up to a potential announcement with two of the municipalities within the Metro Van region. We had been working with some of the mayors, who, by the way, many of the mayors in the Metro Van region have been champions for housing. There is no personal feud tied into any of this. I'm only interested in getting more homes built. One of the things that I have a difficult time accepting is the cognitive dissonance within some of the Metro Van members who, on their Housing Accelerator Fund application, have indicated that they would waive certain development cost charges within their own municipality, and that would lead to additional housing output that should entitle them to funds under the Housing Accelerator Fund, while at the same time suggesting that increases to similar development cost charges in the Metro Van region that will apply in their municipality wouldn't have the opposite effect. We're undertaking an exercise presently to understand our anticipated impact of those development cost charges, to understand whether that will result in reduced funding eligibility for some of the applicants from the Metro Van region.
We're just going to stop it there, Minister. Thank you so much for being willing to do this. I believe your colleagues are now here and ready to begin with the formal portion of today's events. We appreciate your time. Thank you.
Of course. Maybe you'll let me out early.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Press Theatre for today's press conference featuring Ministers Freeland, Anand, and Fraser. I believe we do have some opening remarks, and then we will open the floor for questions. Ministers,
Okay.
go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And ironically, Sean had the shorter commute joining us virtually. Bonjour. Je vais d'abord aborder le régime de pension du
Good
Canada
afternoon.
et
I
ensuite
will
le
begin
progrès
by talking about
important
the Canada Pension
accompli
Plan,
dans le
and
cadre
then I
de
will
notre
talk
plan pour
about the
aider les
progress
Canadiens et
that we've made
Canadiennes
to
à
help
épargner pour leur
save up
première mise de fonds.
for their first
Par la
down
suite,
payment
je
on a
vais
home.
céder la parole au
Then I
ministre
will give
Sean
the
Fraser,
floor to Minister
qui nous
Sean
fournira
Fraser,
une mise à
who
jour au
will give
sujet
us an
de notre nouveau
update
fonds pour
on our
accélérer la
new
construction de logements et de la façon
Building
dont ces
Accelerator
fonds
Fund
aide les communautés à bâtir plus de logements
that is helping
plus rapidement.
communities build
Et
more housing
finalement,
more
ce
quickly.
sera au tour de la
And
ministre
finally,
Anand de
it
prendre
will
la
be
parole.
Minister Anand's turn
So
to
first,
speak.
let me confirm that this Friday, I will be convening a special meeting of provincial and territorial finance ministers to discuss the Government of Alberta's proposed withdrawal from the Canada Pension Plan. For 6 decades, the CPP has been the bedrock of a secure and dignified retirement for Canadians, very much including the people of Alberta. I have heard the concerns of many Canadians, including many Albertans, about the Government of Alberta's proposal to withdraw Albertans from the CPP. The Calgary Chamber of Commerce has said that altering Alberta's pension system could compromise labor mobility, stability for businesses and consumers, and investor confidence. The Alberta Federation of Labor has said that the proposed move to a provincial pension plan would be, quote, truly scary for anyone contemplating a safe and stable retirement. Protecting the pensions of all Canadians is a priority for our government, and I look forward to an important conversation about this with my counterparts from across the country on Friday. We promised to create the tax-free first home savings account in our 2022 budget, and we launched those accounts in April of this year. I was very glad to announce on October 5th, just earlier this month, that 150,000 Canadians had opened a first home savings account. And I am so happy to announce today, less than a month later, that number has climbed to more than 250,000 Canadians who have opened a tax-free first home savings account. Notre gouvernement sait que l'augmentation du prix des
Our government
maisons a
knows
fait en
that
sorte
house
que les
prices
Canadiens,
are
plus
rising and
particulièrement
that
les jeunes,
Canadians,
ont de
particularly
plus
young
en plus de
Canadians, are
mal à
having a
épargner
harder
en vue
time
d'une mise de fonds.
saving up so
Le
that they can put a
logement
down
est
payment on
au
a
cœur
house.
de notre plan économique
Housing is at the
et
heart
le
of our
compte
economic plan.
d'épargne libre d'impôt pour
And
l'achat
the
d'une
First
première
Home Savings
propriété
Account
est un élément essentiel
is an
de notre
essential
plan sur le
element
logement.
of our housing plan.
Le compte d'épargne libre d'impôt pour l'achat
First
d'une
Home
première
Savings
propriété
account
permet aux Canadiens
will
d'épargner
enable
jusqu'à
Canadians to
40
save
000
up
dollars
to
pour
$40,000
l'achat de leur première maison,
to buy their first home.
compared to just 26 days ago. 100,000 more Canadians are saving up for their first home tax-free. This enthusiasm for the tax-free first home savings account shows that the dream and the reality of first home ownership is alive and well in Canada. And through our economic plan, our federal government is going to continue to build more homes faster for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. In the past few weeks, we have taken real, concrete action to continue leading the way in addressing Canada's housing challenge. Je vous remercie et je vais maintenant céder
Thank
la
you very
parole
much.
au
And
ministre
now
Fraser.
over
Sean,
to Minister Fraser.
over to you.
Merci, Chrystia. Merci tout le monde. Et, merci pour des questions juste avant le petit discours. Folks, we're making serious progress when it comes to the housing policies that we are adopting. And sorry, apologies. Is there a microphone on in the room? I'm getting a lot of feedback. Okay, is it coming through okay for you? Okay, I'll continue. Despite the progress we're seeing as a result of the GST cut, as a result of the Canada Mortgage Bond, as a result of the Housing Accelerator Fund, we know there's a lot more to do. But I do have a lot of optimism as a result of some of the deals that we've been able to conclude, as well as the movement we're seeing from municipalities right across the country when it comes to actually changing the way that they build homes. To date, we have signed agreements with London, Halifax, Brampton, Hamilton, Vaughan, and Kelowna. The combined impact of these 6 agreements is going to see more than 13,000 homes built in those cities over the next 3 years. And in those cities alone, the projections are that nearly 110,000 homes will be built as a result of the changes that they're making. The kinds of changes that we're seeing cities adopt allow for more density. They are making it legal to build more homes in neighborhoods that previously did not allow for the kind of density that's going to create more space for people to live in their respective cities. What's very exciting, although 6 deals is a good start, given that this has been in motion only for about 6 weeks, we are seeing extraordinary movement in cities like Calgary, Edmonton, Kitchener, Moncton. Obviously, nous avons conclu une entente avec le Québec, avec les détails dont l'avenir très vite. Mais nous avons des opportunités pour continuer notre travail et collaborer avec la municipalité avec le plus grande ambition pour construire du logement pour tous les Canadiens. In addition to the Housing Accelerator Fund and the excellent news the Minister Freeland has just shared with now 250,000 Canadians, disproportionately young Canadians, who are saving up to buy their first home through the First Home Savings Account, we will be launching a new initiative this week. The Housing Supply Challenge is an initiative that was previously funded and had several rounds play out. Later this week, we are going to be launching the 5th round of the Housing Supply Challenge. This program invites citizens, stakeholders, and experts to propose solutions that are going to help increase Canada's housing supply. The range of different kinds of activities that we will be looking at in this round are going to focus on how industry can propose to create more efficient and cost-effective housing production system. What do I mean by housing production system? Every aspect of the process to get homes built will be included, from conceptualization to design to financing to approvals to construction to operations. We're also going to have a specific carve-out for nonprofit actors focused on community housing. This program is designed to generate ideas that will have a systems-level approach. It's not so much about the individual successful recipients who will receive funding to implement an idea, but it's to demonstrate new ideas that could be applied at scale to help address the housing crisis more fully. During previous rounds, the kinds of projects that we've seen go ahead include additional productive ability for additional dwelling units that are leading to new prefabricated homes that are smaller than a typical single detached home, but can exist on the same property with a 30-day production turnaround at a cost for $75,000 per unit to actually manufacture these kinds of homes. We've also seen new modular design that is led by Indigenous communities that is respecting traditional design elements, but building in modern sustainability and accessibility components to the construction. We've seen further awards made under previous rounds that have resulted in certain companies leading the way when it comes to standardized production for mass timber homes. And we've collaborated previously with academic institutions to have them develop a kit of parts, so to speak, that's designed to offer homes that are prefabricated that are tied to meet local building codes. These are the kinds of ideas that we are generating through the Housing Supply Challenge, and we'll have more details on the rollout of this program later this week. Thank you very much. C'est un plaisir d'être ici dans l'environnement virtuel. Et c'est un plaisir pour moi de porter la parole avec ma collègue ministre Anand.
Merci beaucoup, Sean et Chrystia.
Thank
Et
you very
bonjour
much,
tout le
Sean and
monde.
Chrystia, and
Notre
hello,
gouvernement
everyone.
travaille fort
Our
pour
government
obtenir
is
des
working
résultats
hard
concrets
to achieve
pour les
concrete
Canadiens.
results for
Et c'est
Canadians.
pourquoi le Canada a une
That's
cote de
why
crédit AAA, un
Canada
taux de
has a
chômage
AAA credit
faible
rating
et le ratio de la dette
and
du PIB le plus faible
very
du
favorable
G7. Recently, we saw
GDP to
a
debt ratio.
slight decrease in inflation numbers. The public accounts, which I tabled last week, reported that our deficit decreased by 33% compared to the projected deficit in budget 2022. As we did during the COVID-19 pandemic, we can and we will continue to pivot and refocus our priorities to decrease our deficit. And unlike the opposition, we will do so without cutting supports that Canadians depend on. We decreased our projected deficit while increasing our supports to Canadians, whether through increasing old age security, whether by offering the dental benefit to Canadians, whether by ensuring that we have a grocery rebate in place, and by supporting families through the Canada Child Benefit, as well as $10 a day childcare throughout the country. Our goal is to continue to invest in Canadians all through these difficult moments and beyond. And so what we know is that Canadians are legitimately worried about the cost of living and especially about the cost of groceries. Et comme vous le savez, notre gouvernement va continuer de travailler jour après jour pour rendre le coût de la vie plus abordable pour les Canadiens. And I want to assure you that every file that we examine at Treasury Board, and that is once our cabinet approves a particular policy, the program, once formulated, goes through Treasury Board. Every file is examined with a view to ensuring that affordability issues are top of mind. We will continue to support Canadians during this economic time. Now, for example, two things that Minister Champagne announced last week was that our government will triple the funding for the contributions program for nonprofit consumer and voluntary organizations, and also that we will support consumer organizations in identifying harmful practices such as shrinkflation, meaning that practices where higher prices are in place for lower sizes of products in the retail sector. Now, I just want to close by addressing Bill C-56. That's our affordability legislation, la loi sur le logement et l'épicerie à prix abordable. Grâce à ce projet, nous allons accroître la concurrence, ce qui aura pour effet de réduire la pression sur les prix. And at the very heart of that legislation is the view that Canadians expect us to fight for them, and that is exactly what we are doing in this legislation. And to close, I'd like to call on my colleagues across the House of Commons to vote in favor of this bill so that we can see the removal of the GST on rentals, as well as increased competition and lower grocery prices in Canada. Pour ceux et celles qui veulent appuyer notre population, c'est exactement
For those of us who want to support Canadians,
dois faire et nous devons faire
that is what
pour
has to be done.
les
That's what I
Canadiens
have
et
to do and what we
Canadiennes.
have to do for Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you, ministers. I'm told you have about 15 minutes for questions, and so in the interest of time, we are going to do one question per reporter in the room. If we can get through a single round and go to a second one, that's wonderful. So we will now turn over to tricks and treats, questions. And we'll begin with Mylène.
Bonjour, ma question pour la ministre
Thank you. My
Freeland.
question is for Minister Freeland. Don't you think that the exemption for heating oil is a way of diluting your policy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? No. Question. That was a very short answer. Could you elaborate?
Absolument pas.
Answer. Absolutely not.
On a fait cela pour avoir une politique
We
efficace
did it
et
to
pragmatique
have an effective
réduire
and
les
pragmatic policy to
Le
reduce
mazout
emissions.
est très particulier.
Heating oil is a very
Les
specific
émissions du
case
mazout sont
because
très, très
emissions
élevées.
from heating oil
Le
are very
mazout
high,
coûte très cher.
and it's also very
Et ce sont
expensive.
les gens en général moins nantis
And
et
it is
rurales
generally
qui
people
utilisent
in rural
le mazout.
areas who are lower income
Alors,
who use it.
c'est le gros bon
So
sens
it just makes
du
sense
créer un programme
to
qu'on a
create
créé
a program
pour
like the one we
aider
have
ces gens
created to help
de
those people
changer d'un
switch
système de réchauffement qui
away
utilise le mazout
from
à
a
un
heating system that
système
uses heating oil
écologique
to a
et
more
un système
environmentally
qui
friendly
coûte
one,
moins cher.
and also a
Mais
system
ces
that
gens-là
costs less.
n'ont pas de l'argent
But
pour le faire aujourd'hui.
the people who use
Et ils n'ont pas de
those
l'argent
systems
pour
don't
le
necessarily
faire
have
vite.
the money to
Alors,
do that
on a un
today or to do it
programme
quickly.
qui
So
va
we now have
permettre
a
à ces
program
gens
that
de
will
faire
enable
plus vite
those people
cette
to
transition.
make the transition
C'est
more
le logique.
quickly. That's the logic behind it.
Raisa Patel.
Hi, Minister Freeland. There were some reports about a concept paper from the Israeli government suggesting that residents in Gaza would be transferred to Egypt, with some of them potentially being resettled in Canada. Did Israel make you aware of this proposal? And in general, is Canada open to accepting Palestinian refugees?
I'm unaware of those reports.
Valérie.
Merci. Ma question est pour vous, Madame Freeland. On
I have a
nous
question
dit
for you,
que au sein
Mr.
du
Freeland.
cabinet, c'est vous
We are
qui avez
being told that
poussé
within
pour
Cabinet,
qu'on
you
exempte le mazout,
pushed for
de
the
redevance sur la
exemption
tarification sur le carbone.
on
Maintenant qu'on voit
the
le
carbon
Premier ministre de la
pricing costs on
Saskatchewan
heating oil.
menacé
And now
de ne
we've seen
pas
the
de
Premier of
retirer ou de ne pas
Saskatchewan
renvoyer à
threatening
Ottawa
to
les revenus tirés de
not
la tarification.
send the revenue from the
de vos
tax
collègues
to
probablement
Ottawa.
des autres provinces qui ne sont pas contents
And
non
there are
plus.
also premiers in other
Est-ce que
provinces
c'était
who aren't
vraiment
happy
la
with the
meilleure des
situation.
solutions,
Do you
considérant
think it
que
really
ça
was
crée
the
un
best
autre problème?
solution that you found, since it's creating another problem?
Ce n'est pas correct
Answer.
de discuter nos discussions au sein du cabinet.
I
Alors,
cannot talk
je
about
ne
the
vais pas le
discussions that take
faire.
place in cabinet, so I will not
Et
talk
j'ai
about
juste
that.
expliqué
I
le logique,
just
le logique
explained the
très
logic,
pratique,
the very practical logic
logique
behind
qui pense des
program,
réalités des gens
and that
sur le terrain,
really is based on what
qui
people are
a
experiencing in
motivé
real life.
notre décision.
That is what motivated our decision.
Et je veux juste souligner que le
I
programme
would
qu'on a mis en
like
place
to
pour la
stress the
transition
fact that the program that we set up
du
for the
mazout
transition
à un
away from
système
heating oil to
plus
a
propre pour le
cleaner
réchauffement des maisons.
system for
C'est un programme qui est
house
ouvert à toutes les
heating
provinces et
is
territoires.
is a program that's open to all provinces and territories.
Brian.
Hi, Minister Freeland. Brian Platt from Bloomberg. You were in Washington recently. It looks likely the Prime Minister will be there later this week. The biggest irritant between the two countries still is your plan for a digital services tax. Can you give us an update on where that's at? Are you still confident you can reach a deal on this, or do you still intend to bring one in at the start of next year?
I was in Washington last week, and we did have some good conversations about the DST, including at officials level. I remain cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to reach an understanding with our American partners.
Hi, Mr. Freeland. Yesterday, Premier Ford and Mayor Chow wrote you a letter asking the federal government to join their working group focused on addressing Toronto's financial situation. Just wondering what your response was and what role you see for the federal government in helping Toronto, given you rejected Mayor Chow's request for financial assistance earlier this year.
We agreed to join the working group, and the Deputy Minister of Finance, Chris Forbes, will be joining that group.
We're so efficient today, guys. Greg.
I tried. I know we have limited time.
Greg.
Greg Quinn, Market News International. Mr. Freeland, I believe Bank of Canada Governor Macklem is saying that spending across all levels of government is starting to make his inflation fight a bit harder. How do you balance this in your fiscal plans against any obligations you might have under the Liberal Party's supply and confidence agreement with the NDP?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I reviewed the governor's remarks carefully, and indeed, I talked to him pretty often. And he pointed out that over the past year, fiscal policy has not gotten in the way of monetary policy. I was glad to hear him observe that. We've been very conscious of that and very mindful of that. He did talk about the need for fiscal policy of all levels of government not to get in the way of monetary policy going forward. I am mindful of that also. And I will also point out, as the governor pointed out, that Canada has the lowest deficit in the G7. We have had the fastest rate of fiscal consolidation from the COVID peak in the G7, and we have the lowest debt to GDP ratio.
And I'll just add to that in terms of fiscal policy, we are very concerned with ensuring that our spending is focused on our government's top priorities. That is why the Minister of Finance placed in the budget 2023 the necessity for me as President of the Treasury Board to undertake a spending review. I will be tabling the results in its first iteration of that spending review in November in the supplementary estimates, and then again in the main estimates in the first quarter of next year. All that to say that ministers across our government are submitting to proposals to me, and all of those proposals are their effort in their respective departments to ensure that we do not have wasteful spending and that our spending is actually directed to our government's priorities, the top of which is affordability for Canadians. Through this spending review, we will be refocusing $15 billion of spending over 5 years and $4 billion each year thereafter. And I think that is an important lens in which to examine the relationship between fiscal and monetary policy.
Yeah. I agree.
In parliamentary parlance, I see the clock at 8 minutes after 2, so if Minister Anand, I understand you might need to leave.
I will.
Okay. Anyway, we'll continue down our list. Our next question is from Mia Rabson, Canadian Press.
I'm just wondering if the issue with home heating oil mostly is the cost of the oil itself, and we've acknowledged that home heating oil is worse for the environment than other sources. Why is taking the carbon price itself off home heating oil the answer to the affordability issue? And are you not just undermining your carbon policy overall, particularly when you now have even premiers like in Saskatchewan saying they're just going to stop paying it?
No, we're not undermining the policy overall. Home heating oil has some very specific characteristics. Home heating oil is a very polluting form of heating oil. Home heating oil also is really expensive, and home heating oil tends to be used by low-income and rural people. And when you take those three characteristics together, it makes a lot of sense to do what the Prime Minister announced last week, which is to create a program that will accelerate the transition from home heating oil to heat pumps, to create a program that will allow people who are using home heating oil, who are paying a lot for that heavily polluting form of oil, but who just don't have the money to buy a heat pump right now, to make it possible for them to make a change that is going to be good for them, good for their family budgets, and good for the planet. But people can't make that change if they don't have the money to do it. And that is what we recognize. That is what we heard across the country. And that is why we've put that program in place. This is going to accelerate the transition and going to make life more affordable for Canadians. It's the right thing to do. And I do want to emphasize that the top up to the heat pump program is available to any province that wants to participate.
David Thurton, CBC.
Hi, Mr. Freeland. You said that you watched Macklin's comments yesterday at a committee. I'm wondering what you think about what he had to say about whether or not the carbon price is fueling inflation. And Conservatives, their takeaway from that was that it's contributing as much as 16% to inflation. So is the carbon price fueling inflation?
I said I read his comments carefully. When it comes to the carbon price, I think the verdict of economists in Canada and around the world is absolutely clear. And the verdict is that this is the most efficient way to address climate change. It is the most efficient way to reduce emissions. That's something that the IMF has pointed out. The IMF has very explicitly commended Canada's price on pollution as a model for countries around the world. And just a couple of days ago, the chief economist of the IMF, or maybe her name is the deputy managing director. Anyway, the number 2 at the IMF wrote a piece in the Financial Times talking about how governments needed to use a price on pollution as a way to fight climate change. One of the arguments she used there, which I very much agree with, is we are at a time when, as a country and countries around the world, need to act urgently to address climate change. That is an economic necessity. We need to do it if we want to have the jobs and the industries of the future here in Canada. At the same time, we are operating in a world of fiscal constraints. And that is one of many reasons that a price on pollution, which is the most efficient way to reduce emissions, makes a lot of sense. And that is why Canada's price on pollution is admired around the world.
Kyle?
Minister, I'm wondering if you have a date for the fall economic statement yet. When is that coming? It is the fall.
I announced a meeting that I'm hosting on Friday, but that is the only date I'm announcing today. I'm not announcing that either.
We have time for a question online, so we're going to go to Paul Vieira. I'm going to unmute you now, Paul. Just a reminder that it's just one question. Go ahead. I think you're unmuted.
Minister, the opposition parties have called on you to block the RBC HSBC deal. Will you heed that request? And what time frame are you looking at in delivering a verdict?
Thanks for the question, Paul. There are very clear rules set out in Canada governing transactions of this sort. And there are clear rules about the institutional input into decisions made about those transactions. We are a rule of law country and a government that believes in supporting our foundational institutions. So we will be following those rules carefully. Given that this is a transaction which is still under review, I'm not going to say anything specific further.
And that concludes today's press conference. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Minister. Wishing you all a safe and happy Halloween.
Okay, and if I could just say I appreciate getting into the spirit of today. Finance Minister. You know what? With terrible mother, I'm not sure what they're going as. That's a terrible thing to admit. Some of them are older, they don't have to tell me these things, but I do have a 14-year-old. I should know what he's going as. Thanks a lot. Happy Halloween.